Shades of Grey. London, January 1874. The building is as grey as the pavement below, and the sky above appearing as impermanent as the clouds, as though it could vanish into the air without notice. Nondescript grey stone renders it indistinguishable from the surrounding buildings, save for a tarnished sign hanging by the door. Even the headmistress inside is clad in a deep charcoal. Yet the man in the grey suit looks out of place. The cut of his suit is too sharp, the handle of his cane too well polished beneath his pristine gloves. He gives his name, but the headmistress forgets it almost instantly and is too embarrassed to ask him to repeat it. Later, when he signs the required paperwork, his signature is completely illegible, and that particular form is lost within weeks of being filed. He presents unusual criteria in what he's looking for. The headmistress is confused, but after a few questions and clarifications, she brings him 3 children, 2 boys and 1 girl. The man requests to interview them privately, and the headmistress reluctantly agrees. The first boy is spoken to for only a few minutes before he's dismissed. When he passes through the hallway, the other 2 children look to him for some indication of what to expect, but he only shakes his head. The girl is kept longer, but she too is dismissed, her forehead wrinkled in confusion. The other boy is then brought into the room to speak with the man in the gray suit. He is directed to sit in a chair across from a desk, while the man stands nearby. The boy does not fidget as much as the first boy did. This boy does not fidget as much as the first boy did. He sits quietly and patiently, his gray-green eyes taking in every detail of the room. This man subtly, every detail of the room and the man, subtly, aware but not outright staring. His dark hair is badly cut, as though the barber was distracted during the process, but some attempt has been made to flatten it. His clothes are ragged but well kept, though his pants are too short, and may once have been blue or brown or green, but have faded too much to be certain. "How long have you been here?" the man asks, after silently examining the boy's shabby appearance for a few moments. "Always," the boy says. "How old are you?" "I'll be 9 in May." "You look younger than that. It's not a lie." "I did not mean to suggest that it was." The man in the gray suit stares at the boy without comment for some time. The boy stares back. "You can read, I presume?" the man asks. The boy nods. "I like to read," he says. "There aren't enough books here. I've read all of them already." "Good." Without warning, the man in the gray suit tosses his cane at the boy. The boy catches it in one hand easily without flinching, though his eyes narrow in confusion as he looks from the cane to the man and back. The man nods to himself and reclaims his cane, pulling a pale handkerchief from his pocket to wipe the boy's fingerprints from the surface. "Dude, you're so fucking pretentious." "Very well," the man says. "You will be coming to study with me. I assure you I have a great many books. I will make the necessary arrangements, and then we shall be on our way." "Do I have a choice? Do you wish to remain here?" The boy considers this for a moment. "No," he says. "Very well. Don't you want to know my name?" the boy asks. "Names are not of nearly as much import as people like to suppose," the man in the gray suit says. "A label assigned to identify you either by this institution or your departed parents is neither of interest nor value to me. If you find you are in need of a name at any point, you may choose one for yourself. For now, it will not be necessary." The boy is sent to pack his small bag of negligible possessions. The man in the gray suit signs papers and responds to the headmistress's questions with answers she does not entirely follow, but she does not protest the transaction. When the boy is ready, the man in the gray suit takes him from the gray stone building, and he does not return. Sorry. My neck is shitty. Magic lessons. 1875 to 1880. Celia grows up in a series of theaters, most often in New York, but there are long stretches in other cities: Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, occasional excursions to Milan or Paris or London. They blend together in a haze of musk and velvet and sawdust, to the point where she sometimes does not recall what country she is in. Not that it matters. Her father brings her everywhere while she is small, parading her like a well-loved small dog in expensive gowns. I told you. For his colleagues and acquaintances to fawn over in pubs after performances. When he decides she is too tall to be an adorable accessory, he begins abandoning her in the dressing rooms or hotels. She wonders each night if perhaps he will not return, but he always stumbles in at unseemly hours, sometimes petting her gently on the head while she pretends to be asleep, other times ignoring her entirely. Lessons have become less formal. When before he would sit her down at marked, though irregular times, now he tests her constantly, but never in public. Even tasks as simple as tying her boots he forbids her to do by hand. She stares at her feet, silently willing the laces to tie and untie in messy bows, scowling when they tangle into knots. Her father is not forthcoming when she asks questions. She has gathered that the man in the gray suit, whom her father called Alexander, also has a student, and there will be some sort of game. Like chess, she asks once. No, her father says, not like chess. The boy grows up in a townhouse in London. He sees no one, not even when his meals are delivered to his rooms, appearing by the door on covered trays and disappearing in the same manner. Once a month, a man who does not speak is brought in to cut his hair. Once a year, the same man takes measurements for new clothing. The boy spends most of his time reading, and writing, of course. He copies down sections of books, writes out words and symbols he does not understand at first, but that become intimately familiar beneath his ink-stained fingers, formed again and again in increasingly steady lines. He reads histories and mythologies and novels. He slowly learns other languages, though he has difficulty speaking them. There are occasional excursions to museums and libraries during off hours when there are few, if any, other visitors. The boy adores these trips for both the contents of the buildings and the deviation from his set routine, but they are rare, and he is never permitted to leave the house unescorted. The man in the gray suit visits him in his rooms every day, most often accompanied by a new pile of books, spending exactly 1 hour lecturing about things the boy is unsure he will ever truly understand. Only once does the boy inquire as to when he will actually be allowed to do something, the kinds of things that the man in the gray suit demonstrates very rarely himself during these strictly scheduled lessons. When you are ready is the only answer he receives. He is not deemed ready for some time. The doves that appear on stage and occasionally in the audience during Prospero's performances are kept in elaborate cages, delivered to each theater along with the rest of his luggage and supplies. A slamming door sends a stack of trunks and cases trembling in his dressing room, toppling a cage full of doves. The trunks right themselves instantly, but Hector picks up the cage to inspect the damage. While most of the doves are only dazed from the fall, one clearly has a broken wing. Hector carefully removes the bird, the damaged bars repairing as he sets the cage down. "Can you fix it?" Celia asked. Her father looks at the injured dove and then back at his daughter, waiting for her to ask a different question. "Can I fix it?" she asks after a moment. "Go ahead and try," her father says, handing it to her. Celia gently strokes the trembling dove, staring intently at its broken wing. The bird makes a painful, strangled sound, much different than its normal coo. "I can't do it," Celia says with tears in her eyes, lifting the bird up to her father. Hector takes the dove and swiftly twists its neck, ignoring his daughter's cry of protest. "Living things have different rules," he says. "You should practice with something more basic." He picks up Celia's only doll from a nearby chair and drops it on the floor, the porcelain head cracking open. When Celia returns to her father the next day with the perfectly repaired doll, he only nods his approval before waving her away, returning to his pre-performance preparations. "You could have fixed the bird," Celia says. "Then you wouldn't have learned anything," Hector says. "You need to understand your limitations so you can overcome them. You do want to win, don't you?" Celia nods, looking down at her doll. It bears no evidence that it had ever been damaged, not a single crack along the vacant, smiling face. She throws it under a chair and does not take it with her when they depart the theater. The man in the gray suit takes the boy for a week in France that is not precisely a holiday. The trip is unannounced, the boy's small suitcase packed without his knowledge. The boy assumes they are there for some manner of lesson, but no particular area of study is specified. After the first day, he wonders if they are visiting only for the food. Entranced by the luscious crackle of the fresh-baked bread in boulangeries and the sheer variety of cheeses. Sounds amazing. I love cheese. There are off-hour trips to silent museums, where the boy tries and fails to walk through galleries as quietly as his instructor does, cringing when each footfall echoes. Though he requests a sketchbook, his instructor insists it will be better to him to capture the images in his memory. One evening, the boy is sent to the theater. He expects a play, or perhaps a ballet, but the performance is something he finds unusual. The man on the stage, a slick-haired, bearded fellow whose white gloves move like the birds against the black of his suit, performs simple tricks and sleight-of-hand misdirections. Birds disappear from cages with false bottoms. Handkerchiefs slip from pockets to be concealed again in cuffs. The boy watches both the magician and his modest audience curiously. The spectators seem impressed by the deceptions, often applauding them politely. When he questions his instructor after the show, he is told the matter will not be discussed until they return to London at the end of the week. The next evening, the boy is brought to a larger theater and again left alone for the performance. The sheer size of the crowd makes him nervous. He has never been in a space so full of people before. The man on this stage appears older than the magician from the previous night. He wears a nicer suit. His movements are more precise. Every exhibition is not only unusual, but captivating. The applause is more than polite. And this magician does not hide handkerchiefs within his lace shirt cuffs. The birds that appear from all manner of locations have no cages at all. These are feats that the boy has only seen in his lessons. Manipulations and illusions he has been expressly informed again and again must be kept secret. The boy applauds as well when the Prospero the Enchanter takes his final bow. Again, his instructor refuses to answer any of his questions until they return to London. Once in the townhouse, falling back into a routine that now feels as though it had never been disrupted, the man in the gray suit first asks the boy to tell him the difference between the two performances. The first man was using mechanical contraptions and mirrors, making the audience look different places when he did not wish them to see something, to create a false impression. The second man, the one named after the Duke from The Tempest, he was pretending to do similar things, but he did not use mirrors or tricks. He did things the way you do. Very good. Do you know that man? The boy asks. I have known that man for a very long time, his instructor says. Does he teach those things as well, the way you teach me? His instructor nods, but does not elaborate. How can the people watching not see the difference? The boy asks. To him it is clear, though he cannot properly articulate why. It was something he felt in the air as much as observed with his eyes. People see what they wish to see, and in most cases, what they are told that they see. Damn. They do not discuss the matter further. While there are other not quite holidays, though they are rare, the boy is not taken to see any other magicians. Prospero the Enchanter uses a pocket knife to slit his daughter's fingertips open, one by one, watching wordlessly as she cries until calm enough to heal them, drips of blood slowly creeping backwards. The skin melds together, swirls of fingerprint ridges finding one another again, closing solidly once more. Celia's shoulders fall, releasing the tension that has knotted in them, but her relief palpable as she draws herself safely together. Her father gives her only moments to rest before slicing each of her newly healed fingers again. Dude, what the fuck is wrong with you? Seriously. The man in the gray suit takes a handkerchief from his pocket and drops it on the table, where it lands with a muffled thump, something heavier than silk in the folds. He pulls the square of silk upward, letting the contents, a solitary gold ring, roll out onto the table. It is slightly tarnished and engraved with something that the boy thinks might be words in Latin, but the script is looping and flourished, and he cannot make them out. The man in the gray suit replaces the now empty handkerchief in his pocket. Today we're going to learn about binding, he says. When they reach the point of the lesson that includes the practical demonstration, he instructs the boy to place the ring on his own hand. He never touches the boy, regardless of the circumstances. The boy tries in vain to pry the ring from his finger as it dissolves into his skin. Bindings are permanent, my boy, the man in the gray suit said. He's not your boy. What am I bound to? The boy asks, frowning at the scar where the ring had been moments before. An obligation you already had and a person you will not meet for some time. The details are not important at this point. This is merely a necessary technicality. The boy only nods and does not question further, but that night when he is alone again and unable to sleep, he spends hours staring at his hand in the moonlight, wondering who the person he is bound to might be. Thousands of miles away, in a crowded theater that thunders with applause for the man on stage, hidden in the shadows formed between disused pieces of scenery backstage, Celia Bowen curls herself into a ball and cries. I want to give her so many hugs. I want to give her so many hugs. Okay. Oh god, I'm gonna mispronounce this. Le Bateleur? I have no idea what that means. London, May to June, I keep saying 19. London, May to June, 1884. Just before the boy turns 18, the man in the gray suit removes him from the townhouse without notice, setting him up in a modestly sized flat with a view of the British Museum. At first, he assumed that it is only a temporary matter. There have been of late journeys of weeks or even months to France and Germany and Greece, filled with more studying than sightseeing, but this is not one of those not-quite holidays spent in luxurious hotels. It is a modest flat with basic furnishings, so similar to his former rooms that he finds it difficult to feel anything resembling homesickness, save for the library, though he still possesses an impressive number of books. There is a wardrobe full of well-cut but nondescript black suits, crisp white shirts, a row of custom-fitted bowler hats. Custom hats, okay. He inquires as to when what is referred to only as his challenge will begin. The man in the gray suit will not say, though the move clearly marks the end of formal lessons. Instead, he continues his studies independently. He keeps notebooks full of symbols and glyphs, working through his old notes and finding new elements to consider. He carries smaller volumes with him at all times, transcribing them into larger ones once they are filled. He begins each notebook the same way, with a detailed drawing of a tree inscribed with black ink inside the front cover. From there, the black branches stretch onto the subsequent pages, tying together lines that form letters and symbols, each page almost completely covered in ink. All of it, runes and words and glyphs, twisted together and grounded to the initial tree. There is a forest of such trees, carefully filed on his bookshelves. He practices the things that he has been taught. Though it is difficult to gauge the effectiveness of his illusions on his own, he spends a great deal of time regarding reflections in mirrors. Unscheduled and no longer under lock and key, he takes long walks around the city. The sheer volume of people is nerve-wracking, but the joy in being able to leave his flat whenever he chooses outweighs his fear of accidentally bumping into passerby as he attempts to traverse the streets. He sits in parks and cafes, observing people who pay him little notice as he blends into crowds of young men in interchangeable suits and bowler hats. One afternoon, he returns to his old townhouse, thinking perhaps it would not be in a position to call in his instructor for something as simple as tea, but the building is abandoned, the window is boarded. As he walks back to his flat, he places a hand on his pocket and realizes that his notebook is missing. He swears aloud, attracting a glare from a passing woman who steps aside as he stops short on the crowded pavement. He retraces his steps, growing more anxious with each turn. A light rain begins to fall. Not much more than mist, but several umbrellas spring up amongst the crowd. He pulls the brim of his bowler hat down to better shield his eyes as he searches the dampening pavement for any sign of a notebook. He stops at a corner beneath the awning of a cafe, watching the lamps flickering on up and down the street, wondering if he should wait until the crowd thins or the rain lets up. Then he notices that there is a girl standing some paces away, also sheltered beneath the awning, and she is poring over the pages of a notebook that he is quite certain is his own. She's perhaps 18, perhaps a bit younger. Her eyes are light, and her hair is an indeterminate color that cannot seem to decide if it is blonde or brown. She wears a dress that would have been quite fashionable 2 years ago and is damp from the rain. He steps closer, but she does not notice. She stays completely absorbed in the book. She has even removed one of her gloves to better handle the delicate pages. He can now see that it is indeed his own journal, open to a page with a card pasted onto it, written with winged creatures crawling over a spoked wheel. Printed with winged creatures crawling over a spoked wheel. His handwriting covers the card and the paper around it, incorporating it into solid text. He watches her expression as she flips through the pages, a mixture of confusion and curiosity. "I believe you have my book," he says after a moment. The girl jumps in surprise and nearly drops the notebook, but manages to catch it, though in the process her glove flutters to the pavement. He bends down to retrieve it, and when he straightens and offers it to her, she seems surprised to see that he is smiling at her. "I'm sorry," she says, accepting her glove and quickly pushing the journal to him. "You dropped it in the park, and I was trying to give it back, but I lost track of you, and then I'm sorry." She stops, flustered. "That's quite all right," he says, relieved to have it back in his possession. I was afraid it was lost for good, which would have been unfortunate. I owe you my deepest gratitude, Miss Martin," she supplies, and it sounds like a lie. "Isabel Martin." A questioning look follows, waiting for his own name. "Marco," he says. "Marco Alastair." The name tastes strange on his tongue, the opportunities to speak it aloud falling few and far between. He has written this variant of his given name combined with a form of his instructions alias so many times that it seems like his own, but adding sound to symbol is a different process entirely. The ease at which Isabel accepts it makes it feel more real. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Alastair," she says. He should thank her and take his book and go. It's the sensible thing to do, but he is not particularly inclined to return to his empty flat. Might I buy you a drink as a token of my thanks, Miss Martin? He asks, after slipping the notebook into his pocket. Isabel hesitates, likely knowing better than to accept invitations for drinks from strange men on darkened street corners, but to his surprise she nods. That would be lovely, thank you, she says. Very well, Marco says. There are better cafes than this particular one. He gestures at the window next to them. Within a reasonable distance, if you don't mind a damp walk. I'm afraid I don't have an umbrella with me. I don't mind, Isabel says. Marco offers her his arm, which she takes, and they set off down the street in the softly falling rain. They walk only a block or two and then down a rather narrow alley, and Marco can feel her tense in the darkness, but she relaxes when he stops at a well-lit doorway next to a stained-glass window. He holds the door open for her as they enter a tiny cafe, one that has quickly become his favorite over the past few months, one of the few places in London where he feels truly at ease. Candles flicker in glass holders on every available surface. The walls are painted a rich, bold red. There are only a few patrons scattered about the intimate space and plenty of empty tables. They sit at a small table near the window. Marco waves at the woman behind the bar, who brings them 2 glasses of Bordeaux, leaving the bottle on the table next to a small vase holding a yellow rose. Oh. As the rain patters gently against the windows, they converse politely about insubstantial things. Marco volunteers very little information about himself, and Isabel responds in kind. When he asks if she is hungry, she gives the polite non-answer that betrays that she is famished. Mood. He catches the attention of the woman behind the bar again, who returns a few minutes later with a platter of cheese and fruit and slices of baguette. How did you find a place like this? Isabel asks. Trial and error, he says, and a great many glasses of horrible wine. Isabel laughs. I'm sorry, she says, though at least it worked out well in the end. This place is lovely. It's like an oasis. An oasis with very good wine, Marco agrees, tipping his glass towards her. It reminds me of France, Isabel says. Are you from France? He asks. No, Isabel says, but I lived there for a while. As did I, Marco says, though that was some time ago. You are correct. This place is very French, and I think that's part of the charm. So many places here don't bother to be charming. You're charming, Isabel says, and immediately blushes, looking like she would pull the words back into her mouth if she could. I relate to her a lot. Thank you, Marco replies, unsure of what else to say. I'm sorry, Isabel says, clearly flustered. I didn't mean to... She begins to trail off, but perhaps emboldened by a glass and a half of wine, she continues. There are charms in your books. In your book, she says. She looks to him for a reaction, but he says nothing, and she looks away. Charms, she continues to fill the silence. Talismans, symbols. I don't know what all of them mean, but they are charms, are they not? She takes a nervous sip of her wine before daring to look back at him. Marco chooses his words carefully, wary about the direction the conversation is taking. And what does a young lady who once lived in France know of charms and talismans? He asks. Only things I've read in books, she says, and I don't remember what all of them mean. I only know the astrological symbols and some of the alchemical ones, and I don't know them particularly well either. She pauses as though she cannot decide whether or not she wants to elaborate. Then she adds, La Roue de Fortune, the Wheel of Fortune, the card in your book. I know that card. I have a deck myself. I do too. I should use it more often. While earlier Marco had determined her to be little more than mildly intriguing and fairly pretty, this revelation is something more. He leans into the table, regarding her with considerably increased interest than he had moments before. Do you mean you read the tarot, Miss Martin? He asks. Isabel nods. I do. At least I try, she says. Only for myself, though, which I suppose is not really reading. It's just something I picked up a few years ago. Do you have your deck with you? Marco asks. Isabel nods again. I would very much like to see it if you don't mind, he asks. He adds, when she makes no move to take it from her bag. Isabel glances around the cafe at the other patrons. Marco gives a dismissive wave. Don't worry yourself about them, he says. It takes a great deal more than a deck of cards to frighten this lot. But if you'd rather not, I understand. No, I don't mind, Isabel says, picking up her bag and carefully pulling out a deck of cards wrapped in a scrap of black silk. Ooh. She removes the cards from their covering and places them atop the table. May I? Marco asks as he moves to pick them up. No, don't touch another person's tarot cards. That's rude. By all means, Isabel answers, surprised. Some readers do not like other people touching their cards, Marco explains, recalling details from his divination lessons as he gently lifts the deck. And I would not want to be presumptuous. He turns over the top card. Le Battleur. The Magician. So that's what that means. Marco cannot help but smile at the card before replacing it in the pile. Do you read? Isabel asks him. Oh no, he says. I am familiar with the cards, but they do not speak to me, not in ways enough to properly read. He looks up from the cards at Isabel, still not certain what to make of her. They speak to you, though, do they not? I have never thought of it that way, but I suppose they do, she says. She sits quietly, watching him flip through the deck. He treats it with the same care she showed to his journal, holding the cards delicately by their edges. When he has looked through the entire deck, he places them back on the table. They are very old, he asks. Much older than you, I would venture to guess. Might I inquire as to how they came into your possession? I found them in a jewelry box in an antiques shop in Paris years ago, Isabel says. The woman there wouldn't even sell them to me. She just told them to take them away, get them out of her shop. Devil cards, she called them. Carte du diable. People are naive about such things, Marco says, a phrase oft repeated by his instructor as both admonishment and warning. And they would rather write them off as evil than attempt to understand them. An unfortunate truth, but a truth nonetheless. What is your notebook for? Isabel asks. I don't mean to pry, I just found it interesting. I hope you'll forgive me for looking through it. Well, we are even on that matter now that you have allowed me to look through your cards, he says, but I'm afraid it is rather complex and not the easiest matters to explain or believe. I can believe quite a lot of things, Isabel says. Marco says nothing, but he watches her as intently as he had regarded the cards. Isabel holds his gaze and does not look away. It is too tempting. To have found someone who might even begin to understand the world he has lived in almost his entire life. He knows he should let it go, but he cannot. I could show you if you wish, he says after a moment. I would like that, Isabel says. They finish their wine, and Marco settles their bill with the woman behind the bar. He places his bowler hat on his head and takes Isabel's arm as they leave the warmth of the cafe, stepping out once again into the rain. Marco stops abruptly in the middle of the next block, just outside a long, gated courtyard. It is set back from the street, a cobblestone alcove formed by gray stone walls. This will do, he says. He leads Isabel off the pavement and into the space between the wall and the gate, positioning her so her back is against the cold, wet stone, and stands directly in front of her, so close that she can see each drop of rain on the brim of his bowler hat. Do for what? She asks, apprehension creeping into her voice. The rain is still falling around them, and there is nowhere to go. Marco simply raises a gloved hand to quiet her, concentrating on the rain and the wall behind her head. He has never had someone to try this particular feat on before. He is uncertain he will even be able to manage it. Do you trust me, Miss Martin? He asks, watching her with the same intense stare from the cafe, only this time his eyes are barely inches from her own. Yes, she says without hesitation. That's dumb. This is the 1800s. Why are you trusting a man you just met today? Okay. Good, Marco says, and with a swift movement, he lifts his hand and places it firmly over Isabel's eyes. Startled, Isabel freezes. Her vision is obscured completely. She can see nothing and feels only the damp leather against her skin. She shivers and is not entirely sure it is due to the cold or the rain. A voice close to her ear whispers words she has to strain to hear, and she does not understand. And then she can no longer hear the rain, and the stone wall behind her feels rough when moments ago it had been smooth. The darkness is somehow brighter, and then Marco lowers his hand. Blinking as her eyes adjust to the light, Isabel first sees Marco in front of her, but something is different. There are no drops of rain on the brim of his hat. There are no drops of rain at all. Instead, there is sunlight, casting a soft glow around him. But that is not what makes Isabel gasp. What elicits the gasp is the fact that they're standing in a forest, her back pressed up against a huge, ancient trunk tree. The trees are bare and black, the branches stretching into the bright blue expanse of sky above them. The ground is covered in a light dusting of snow that sparkles and shines in the sunlight. It is a perfect winter day, and there is not a building in sight for miles, only expanse of snow and wood. A bird calls in a nearby tree, and one in the distance answers it. Isabel is baffled. It is real. She can feel the sun against her skin and the bark of the tree beneath her fingers. The cold of the snow is palpable, though she realizes her dress is no longer wet from the rain. Even the air she's breathing into her lungs is unmistakably crisp country air, with not a hint of London smog. It cannot be, but it is real. This is impossible, she says, turning back to Marco. He smiles, his bright green eyes dazzling in the winter sun. Nothing is impossible, he says. Isabel laughs, the high-pitched, delighted laugh of a child. A million questions rush through her head, and she cannot properly articulate any of them. And then a clear image of a card springs suddenly into her mind. Le Bateleur. You're a magician, she says. I don't think anyone has actually called me that before, Marco responds. Isabel laughs again, and she is still laughing when he leans in closer and kisses her. The pair of birds circle overhead as a light wind blows through the branches of the trees around them. To passerby on the darkened London street, they look like nothing out of the ordinary, only young lovers kissing in the rain. Aww. Aww. But also, like, I feel like kissing in the rain is not as much fun as the movies would like you to think it is. I have no proof, but it does not sound too pleasant. It sounds cold and wet and weird.